Well, welcome everyone. We're excited that you're joining us for today's workshop. Uh, this is going to be a workshop on Blackberry production, and I am Patrick Byers. I'm a field specialist in horticulture with University of Missouri Extension, and I'm partnering with Springfield Community Gardens to offer the workshop today. And I wanted to introduce my co-host, Hannah Hodge. Hannah, would you like to say just a few words about yourself?
Yeah, I work for Springfield Community Gardens, and I'm currently located in Berkeley, California. And I do have a pretty extensive horticultural background, and yeah, super excited to learn about blackberries.
Very good, very good. Well, I'm glad that Hannah is with me today. We'll be kind of team taking this Zoom session, and Hannah will be watching the Zoom. And I wanted to mention the Zoom at this point. If you've been on a Zoom meeting before, chat. If you've been on a Zoom meeting before, you may have interacted with the presenters using chat. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little white box that says chat. And we're going to use chat as our way to ask questions today. So during the presentations, if you have any questions at all, please enter them into the chat, and Hannah will be watching for those.
I don't see it.
And she'll mention that to us as we go through, and we'll stop and tackle those questions. The format for today, we'll have two presentations. The first one will be on Blackberry production, and then the second presentation will be on Blackberry cultivars. And this is basically based on feedback I've had over the years as far as what people are interested in. So that's what we're going to tackle. But any subject related to blackberries is fair game. So if you have any questions related to growing blackberries, eating blackberries, planting blackberries, anything, feel free to ask it in the chat, and we'll tackle it. Okay, a couple of things. I would appreciate it if everyone would mute themselves. It's been my experience with these Zoom workshops that if people's mics are open, sooner or later something embarrassing is going to happen, and we don't want that to happen to anyone. So please mute your microphones. And secondly, let's keep our videos off as well. And the reason for that is that oftentimes there's bandwidth issues, and I found that Zoom meetings tend to go smoother if the videos are off. Okay. Let's see. Anything else? I think that's it as far as housekeeping. Let's go ahead and start off with just a quick poll. I'm curious to learn a little bit more about the audience today, so I'm going to drop a poll in here. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see this poll. If you don't mind, click on the button that describes you and your interest in blackberries.
I'm also going to fill this out.
Okay. Okay, for those who've just joined us, we're taking a poll to get a feel for who the audience is. So if you don't mind to click the button that describes you. Okay, let's go ahead and end the poll, and let's take a look at what we have to say. It looked like a number of us are home gardeners who are interested in blackberries, but we also have several people who are considering farming, so that's great as well. Okay, well, let's go ahead and stop the poll. And again, for those of you who just joined us, remember that anytime you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat. There's a small white box at the bottom of your screen that says chat. You click on that and type in your question. And my co-host Hannah will be monitoring the chat. Okay, I think at this point, Hannah, let's go ahead and shut down our videos.
Okay.
All right. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and we'll get started on the presentation. Forgive me while I clean up a little bit of stuff here.
I'm sure I could go play with it.
Sounds like someone's mic is unmuted. If you don't mind to mute your mic. Okay, let's see if I can get this to come up. Okay. Hannah, if you could give me an okay, can you see the presentation and is my sound quality good?
Oh yeah, I can see the presentation and the sound quality is great.
Okay, very
in
good.
In the chat, it looks like it's Bethany Smith needs to
Yes.
unmute. Yeah.
Bethany Smith.
What about me?
Oh, if you could please mute your microphone, Bethany. Thank you.
Sorry.
Sorry, my
No,
bad.
no problem, no problem. We just, okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started. And I think actually, Hannah, if people need help muting their mics, I think you can go ahead and do that for them.
Okay, sounds great.
Okay, very good. So we're going to talk about Blackberry production and a little bit of background about your speaker. I'm a field specialist in horticulture with the University of Missouri Extension. I'm actually based in Webster County, which is one county to the east of Greene County, which is the Springfield metro area. And I live on a farm there. I've been involved with blackberries in one way or another now for about 35 years. I began my career in the fruit breeding programs at the University of Arkansas, which is where many of our favorite blackberry cultivars originated. And then I've worked over the years with many successful blackberry farmers and home blackberry growers. And so what I'm sharing with you today is, of course, certainly based upon research and all that sort of thing, but it's also based on the experience of hundreds of people who have successfully grown blackberries. And again, not just blackberry farmers, but people growing blackberries in their home gardens. The material we're going to talk about is, again, first of all, a general overview of blackberry production. And this is kind of targeted for farmers who might be thinking about blackberries, but the information is equally applicable to home gardeners. So there's lots of information here. Please, if there's a question, put it into the chat and we will tackle it. Okay. I do want to certainly give credit to Springfield Community Gardens. Springfield Community Gardens is my partner on this and the other workshops that we've been doing here over the past 3 years. Springfield Community Gardens is a grassroots organization that is focused on the local food system in Springfield, Greene County. Their vision, a community where everyone has access to healthy local food. They coordinate a number of community gardens across the city, across the metro area. They also have a very innovative beginning farmer program. And they've successfully worked with a number of people who are now growing fruits and vegetables for commercial sales. Springfield Community Gardens has received several grants from the U.S. Department of Agriculture to help support beginning farmers and local food systems. And our workshops today are part of those projects that are funded by the USDA. And I'm going to mention at this point, and I'll also mention at the end of the presentation, we would be so grateful if you would answer a short poll that I will send you in an email to help give us feedback to the USDA relative to the workshop. The USDA, of course, wants feedback on how effectively we've been using the funds that they've provided us. And the only way we can do that is to ask you for your help. So I will be sending everyone an email with a link to an online survey. I promise it won't take longer than 5 minutes, and your contribution will be much appreciated. The USDA, through their funding, is supporting this workshop, and I just wanted to point out some of the resources that are available from the USDA to support farmers, both beginning farmers and established farmers. The Farm Services Agency has an office in every county, and that is the entry point for the programs that the USDA has in place to support farmers. If you want details on these, that last point, farmers.gov resources, will give you a wonderful overview of what they have available. The Natural Resources Conservation Service has cost share programs in place to help farmers. You know, for example, a very successful program in recent years has been the high tunnel cost share, which has helped fund a portion of the cost of high tunnels on at least, I'm not sure of the exact number, but it's somewhere around 80 farms in the Springfield and surrounding counties area. And these programs will help pay for part of the cost of erecting a high tunnel. And again, a high tunnel is an extremely valuable part of the farm for a commercial specialty crop farmer. There's even applications for high tunnels that can be in place for home food growers. So consider that as well. But the USDA, again, has programs that are there to support us, and we need to be taking advantage of those programs. So visit your Farm Services Agency office for more information. Okay, so let's talk about blackberries. And again, I hope everyone is as excited about blackberries as I am. I mean, there's few things as wonderful as taking a fresh picked warm blackberry off of the plant and popping it in your mouth and having that burst of juice and flavor and sweetness that goes with ripe blackberries. And hopefully your mouths are watering just like mine is, and looking forward to the harvest that we'll have here in just a few months. But people will ask, well, you know, I love blackberries. I'm thinking about growing them, but what are some of the considerations? So let's take a look at what some of those considerations are. Okay, so blackberry, of course, is a delicious fruit, but it's also a nutritious fruit. It's kind of a well-kept secret that blackberries, for example, have as much soluble fiber as an equivalent weight of oat bran. And quite frankly, I'm going to choose the blackberries over the oat bran. There are also vitamins, minerals, and other substances found in blackberries. And some of these substances, which are found widely in dark-colored fruit, are actually found in very high levels in blackberries. So not only are they delicious, but they're an important part of a healthy diet. There's a blackberry of one sort or another that is well adapted to all of Missouri. Relative to other fruits, they have a reduced pest management spectrum. We'll talk about some pests here in a bit. They're not pest-free, but in general, they're going to be more straightforward to grow than some of the other fruits that we might consider here in Missouri. Short time from planting to production. If you plant blackberries this spring, you'll be picking your first crop in 2021. Straightforward production practices. And if you're thinking about growing blackberries on a commercial scale, you will find a nearly insatiable demand for your crop. We are nowhere near meeting the demand for locally grown blackberries in Missouri. So I would urge farmers who are thinking about diversification, or new farmers who are thinking about crops to grow, to consider blackberries. They grow well in Missouri, planting to fruiting in 1 year. The life of a blackberry planting from the standpoint of profitability is typically 7 to 12 years. So again, this would be the case in a home planting as well as in a commercial planting. And in about 7 years, it's time to start thinking about planting a new blackberry patch. The typical yield's about 100 quarts per 100 foot of row. That would be a backyard garden yield. And if you're thinking about blackberry production on a commercial scale, you can plant at about 6,000 to 10,000 pounds per acre when they're at full production, which is in their second year of cropping. There's 4 types of blackberries that we can grow here in Missouri. Most of the production is focused on the erect, thornless blackberry varieties, and for obvious reasons. They're thornless, and they also support themselves. But there is some interest in erect, thorny blackberries, the semi-erect, thornless blackberries, and a new type of blackberry called a primocane fruiting blackberry. We'll talk more about what primocane fruiting means here in a moment. Now, we should talk a little bit about blackberry growth habits. And there's always confusion when we start throwing out terms like primocane and floricane fruiting and primocane fruiting. So right now, let's define what those different parts of the plant are. And I have a video here that we're going to take a look at. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of the PowerPoint presentation for a moment. And let's take a look at the video. Okay, Hannah, can we see the video?
Yes, yeah, the video looks great.
Very good. I'm Patrick Byers, Field Specialist in Horticulture with University of Missouri Extension. Today we're in a blackberry field, and I'd like to talk about the different types of blackberry shoots, or as we call them, canes. Blackberry as a plant is a perennial, but a given shoot on a blackberry has a 2-year life cycle. The first year, it's called a primocane. The second year, it's called a floricane. The first year shoots typically are vegetative. They grow, but they do not produce blossoms or fruit. That same shoot, the primocane, in its second year is called a floricane. And floricanes produce shoots, blossoms, and fruit. Following fruiting, the floricanes die and are removed by pruning. Let's take a closer look at these different ages of shoots in a blackberry plant. So looking here at the base of this blackberry plant, you'll notice first of all that we have a new shoot coming up here. This is this year's primocane. This shoot will grow vigorously. It will reach 4 to 5 feet in height. It will produce foliage, but it will not produce blossoms or fruit. This shoot is the floricane. This shoot was a primocane last year, as we saw with this shoot. It grew last year, it overwintered. This year, this shoot is beginning to produce smaller shoots, blossoms, and will eventually produce a fruit crop. After fruiting, the floricane will die. This shoot is last year's floricane. So this shoot produced a crop last year. After fruiting, it died, and now it will be removed by pruning. So to review, a blackberry plant typically has shoots of two different ages. Primocanes, as we see down here at the base, floricanes, as we see here. The primocane is a vegetative shoot. The floricane produces blossoms and fruit. Okay, let's go ahead and bring the PowerPoint back up. Okay, hopefully that helped explain the differences between primocanes and floricanes. And again, if there are any questions relative to the different parts of the blackberry plant, please type them in the chat and we will tackle them. I do want to mention that we have a new type of blackberry that actually will produce some flowers and fruit on the primocanes in the first year. And these are called primocane fruiting blackberries. And we'll talk about those here in a moment. We also have two different types of growth habit that we should mention too. Some types of blackberries will generate new shoots that arise between the plants that you originally put in the ground. These are called suckers, and in time, the suckering will help produce essentially a hedgerow of blackberries. In other words, you won't be able to point out easily the original plants you planted. So those are called hedgerow forming blackberries. Other types of blackberries, all of their new shoots are generated from the original plant. That clump, that original plant you planted will get larger, but all the new shoots come from that one area. So those are called clump forming brambles. Now, you know, I'm painting a pretty rosy picture of blackberries, and it's always good to do a bit of a reality check, especially if you're thinking about planting a blackberry planting for commercial production. They can be vulnerable to heat and to winter cold, and temperatures during midwinter that are below 0 degrees Fahrenheit can cause damage to blackberry plantings. They can also have problems with high temperature damage on the fruit. You know, for example, when we're picking blackberries in June and July, if the temperatures are in the mid to upper 90s, we can have some issues related to sunburn or sun scald on the blackberries. The fruit is highly perishable, not a problem in the home garden, but if you're growing blackberries with the idea of selling them off the farm, you have to recognize that that fruit needs to be marketed as soon as possible. It just doesn't have a long shelf life. Blackberries are perishable. Now, of course, that's one of the things that is appealing about blackberries is, you know, they're so a delicate, delicious fruit, but they have to be handled carefully and marketed promptly. There are some pest management issues, which we'll touch on, and blackberries are labor intensive. We don't really have good ways to mechanically harvest blackberries here in Missouri. So if you're a farmer growing blackberries for sale, you've got to decide how you're going to harvest the crop. Or perhaps you'll establish a pick your own farm, or perhaps you'll have a crew that harvests the berries. But the berries have to be harvested promptly when they're ripe.
Patrick,
Yes.
there was a question in the chat in regards to the trellis. Joel Sanders asked, was there effort to feed the primocanes on to each side of the trellis wires?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And we'll be touching on training and trellises a little bit later in the presentation. But at this point, I will mention that one of the benefits of a trellis is that you can change the way that blackberries grow as far as managing their canopies. And for example, there is a trellis called the V trellis where you tie the primocanes on one side and the floricanes on the other. And by doing that, you effectively put all of the fruit on one side of the row where it's easy to harvest. And then the primocanes are growing on the other side of the row where they're easy to manage as well. But we'll talk about that in more detail here a little bit. If there's still questions, please let me know. Okay, so the different types of blackberries, we talked earlier that we have thorny and thornless types. And let's start by talking about the erect thorny blackberries. These are self-supporting. They have thorny shoots, and you can see in that picture that, yes, they are definitely thorny. They spread by root suckers. They're hedgerow type blackberries. They tend to be the toughest blackberries as far as resistance to cold temperatures. And so particularly in northern Missouri, there is still some interest in growing thorny blackberries. The two leading cultivars are Chickasaw and Kiowa, and we'll talk more about those in our second presentation. Now you might ask yourselves, why do I want to grow a thorny blackberry? And that's a good question. But again, if hardiness is a consideration, that might be one reason to consider thorny blackberries. Much of the interest, though, is in the erect thornless blackberries. We've seen just an explosion of new cultivars in this group. The fruit quality is outstanding. They're reasonably hardy, very productive. These types, again, are self-supporting. They're thornless. They spread by root suckers and in time will form a hedgerow as well. They have moderate resistance to cold temperatures, probably a few degrees less tolerance than the thorny types. The cultivars that are currently available, you'll notice there's a common theme to the names of these cultivars: Natchez, Ponca, Cato, Osage, Washita, Navajo, and Apache. These are all named in honor of Native American tribes. This is a hallmark of the University of Arkansas blackberry breeding program. And we'll hear more about that in our presentation on cultivars. These cultivars are arranged in their order of ripening, just for reference. There is a group of blackberries called the semi-erect thornless blackberries. Now, these types are not nearly as self-supporting as the upright types. They generally require a trellis. And if you see that picture there, you'll notice that these are almost like vines. And in the case of this picture, they're tied to a grape trellis. They don't sucker from the root system. All of their shoots come from the original crown that you planted. And again, looking at that picture, you notice at the base of that plant, there's a very discrete crown. This group is less hardy than the erect types, although they do tend to be very productive from the standpoint of fruit. Cultivars that are in this group include Chester, Triple Crown, and Loch Ness. And then I mentioned the primocane types. This is an exciting development. About 15 years ago, we saw the development of the first primocane fruiting blackberries. If you look at that picture there, that is actually the top of a primocane that has developed flowers and fruit. This is a completely new innovation in blackberries. As I mentioned in the video, most blackberries do not produce flowers and fruit on primocanes. They flower and fruit on floricanes in the second year, but this new group does produce flowers and fruit on the primocanes. So what this means is that we can have a crop on the primocanes in the first year. And then that same shoot in the second year will produce even more berries when it's a floricane. The crop on the primocanes is at the tips of the shoots. The crop on that same shoot when it's a floricane is a little further down the shoot, okay? Now, these in Missouri are being promoted as a backyard garden fruit. And they're a wonderful fruit to consider for the home blackberry planting. There are some challenges to growing this type of blackberry in a commercial setting. They are vulnerable to high temperatures. If the weather is warm when they're developing their flowers on the primocanes, that means if the temperatures are warm in May and June, we can see a reduction in flower bud formation and fewer berries when we move into the primocane harvest season in August and September. So again, by all means, plant some of these. But I would caution you against planting a sizable planting for commercial scale production, okay? The ones that have been developed most recently, we'll see these in the second presentation, Primark Freedom and Primark Traveler are both thornless primocane blackberries and would be excellent blackberries to consider for the home garden. Okay, so hopefully everyone is thinking about blackberries and the thought process now moves towards, let's go ahead and get this planting in the ground. What do we need to be thinking about? Well, in choosing a good place to grow blackberries, they require full sun. You want to plant them close to a source of irrigation water. Okay, blackberries are to some degree drought tolerant, but particularly when they're developing a fruit crop, they will benefit from irrigation. You know, how much water does a blackberry planting need? It needs about 1.5 inches of water per week. And if that doesn't come from rain, then you need to be supplying it through irrigation. A well-drained soil is very helpful with successful blackberry production. The soil should be slightly acidic, moderately fertile, and again, not so much for home gardens, but for commercial scale plantings, if you're putting blackberries into a new site, it can be helpful to test the soil for pathogenic nematodes to see if that problem might be present at your site. Getting a spot ready for blackberries, try to plan out ahead before planting your blackberries. And if you can start getting the site ready a year before planting, that's going to be helpful. We'll talk about soil testing here in a moment. If your soil test report suggests that you need some soil amendments, this is the time to put them in. Put them in before you plant. Once your blackberries are in place and growing, it's much more difficult to, for example, incorporate lime into the soil to raise the soil pH. Make sure that you eliminate problem weeds before you plant. And then raised ridges or beds. Blackberries really benefit from well-drained soils, as I mentioned earlier, and you can ensure that your blackberries will have well-drained soils if you plant them on berms, raised ridges, or in raised beds. Okay, so again, I mentioned irrigation. Make sure that you have enough water. If you're thinking about a commercial scale blackberry planting, I always advise farmers to work with irrigation professionals to help plan their irrigation setups. And make sure you've got good quality water. Many blackberries are watered from wells, and that's an excellent source of water, but be sure that you test your well to make sure that, first of all, the water is of sufficient quality to put through a drip irrigation system, and also make sure that it is safe from the standpoint of produce food safety. Now, think about what grew in the spot where you want to plant your blackberries. You know, if there are wild blackberries growing where you want to plant your tame blackberries, get rid of those wild blackberries. Those wild blackberries are a source of problems that will then hop into your cultivated blackberries. So try to eliminate wild blackberries from around your cultivated plants. Now, how far? At least 60 feet, and the further, the better. If you're planting blackberries on a farm where you've grown vegetables, or if you've got a vegetable garden and you're thinking about planting some blackberries, try to find a spot where you haven't previously grown strawberries, tomatoes, and their relatives like potatoes, peppers, and eggplants, or other brambles within the past 4 to 5 years. And this is because blackberries share some soil-borne diseases with these other crops. And we really want to get this blackberry planting off to a good start.
Patrick, Bethany Smith asked a question.
Yes.
Can blackberries be grown in buckets?
Can blackberries be grown in buckets? Yes, they can. And particularly for people who have limited space and want to grow in containers, yes, they can. Now, you're going to have best success with container-grown blackberries if you plant in a large container, at least 15 gallons. And those who have grown up on farms where there's been a livestock component will know what I talk about when I talk about salt tubs or lick tubs. These are large plastic containers. They're generally about 15 to 20 gallons in capacity, perfect size for a blackberry plant. Drill some holes along the bottom edge of the container, not on the bottom of the container, but along the sides near the bottom. And then fill these containers with a mixture of good quality topsoil, compost, and then some amendments like peat moss and perhaps some perlite to help with aeration. And blackberries will grow beautifully in these containers. As far as the types to grow, I would recommend the upright growing blackberries. And again, since you're going to be generally in close contact with container grown blackberries, plant thornless types. Any of those erect thornless types that I mentioned earlier would be good types to consider for a container. Okay, blackberry soil. In general, many of our soils in Missouri are well suited for blackberries in their natural state, which is great. pH of 5.5 to 6.5, well drained. You want to sample the soil, the upper 6 to 7 inches. The majority of the blackberry plant root system is in the upper 12 inches of the soil. Now, it is helpful to have a deeper soil because that soil doesn't dry out as quickly. And yes, the blackberry roots will penetrate more deeply and they can draw on a larger reservoir of nutrients in a deeper soil. But if you have at least 12 inches to 24 inches of soil depth, you're in great shape for growing blackberries. Again, in a farm setting, try to choose an elevated site for your blackberry planting. Cold air is a lot like water. It moves from high points to low points. And the higher up ground that you plant your blackberries on, the fewer problems you'll have with spring frosts. This spring was a good case in point. We've had frost after frost. And my farm is on high ground. My parents' farm, which is only 4 miles away, is along a creek bottom. And on those frosty mornings where I've had temperatures in the low 30s, they have had temperatures in the mid 20s. So again, just the importance of planting blackberries on high ground. Having an elevated site also reduces humidity and disease problems during the growing season, and it gives you some protection from winds, especially when primocanes are growing. the connection between the primocane and the crown of the plant is a little bit brittle. And if it's a windy spot, the wind movement of those primocanes can actually break them off. Now, a trellis helps with reducing that problem, but having a good spot that's protected from wind is helpful here too. So again, here is our soil test. We're going to collect from the upper 6 to 7 inches of the soil. Probably the most important piece of information that the soil test gives us is soil pH. And again, blackberries have a pretty wide range of adaptability, so that's great. But occasionally we'll have a soil that is too acidic where we need to add lime to raise the soil pH, or perhaps a soil pH that's too high where we want to add powdered sulfur to lower the soil pH. Those are both organic amendments, and they can be very helpful in developing a spot to support long-term growth of your blackberries. The soil test also talks about organic matter content and nutrient content, and then some of the characteristics of the soil too, like cation exchange capacity, neutralizable acidity. And what's very important is the soil test report gives you information on what needs to be done to make that spot suitable for blackberries. And again, for more information, the Soil and Plant Testing Lab at the University of Missouri can help you with collecting a good soil test. At the moment, because of the COVID-19 situation, most county offices are closed. In normal times, the county extension office is a great place to take that soil test, and then the soil test will then be sent on to the soil testing lab.
Patrick, is that a free service?
In Missouri, the soil testing service is not free. The cost of the soil test is typically somewhere between $18 to $25. And that's a cost recovery effort on the part of the soil testing lab. The cost, though, is very reasonable, and the benefits received from that soil test report are huge. And although this is likely difficult to see, this is what a soil test report will look like. The upper part is the actual data on your soil sample. In the middle part there is the recommendations for what might need to be done for the soil to make it suitable for blackberries. And if we look at this particular soil test, we notice that the area where we specified brambles, we don't need to add any potassium or phosphorus. That's fabulous. Our pH is 6.4, so it's right where we want it to be. And the organic matter content is nearly 4%, which is excellent. So this is a great site for blackberries as it stands. Now, organic matter, particularly if you're an organic farmer, an organic gardener, fostering soil health is huge when it comes from fostering blackberry health. And one of the things that we can do as gardeners or as farmers is to build the organic matter level in our soils. Our target is 3 to 5% for blackberries. Again, that previous soil test was nearly 4%, so that's excellent. Building organic matter can certainly be done before you plant, and this can be done by using cover crops or actual additions of organic materials like manure, compost, chicken litter, those sorts of things. Remember that if you're going to add organic matter, try to do this before you plant, at least 6 months. And if you're adding fresh organic matter like manure or chicken litter, 6 months or even a year prior is going to be helpful. If you're adding weathered organic matter, decomposed organic matter such as compost, this can be put on more closer to actual planting. And again, remember there are some produce food safety considerations related to the use of fresh manures in blackberries. Not a consideration before you plant, but once your plants are in place, make sure that you follow all of the guidelines relative to the use of manures. And in the case of blackberries, you would not want to put manure on your planting within 120 days of picking your blackberries. So generally a late fall application or a post-harvest application would be the best time to use manure in blackberries. So weeds are troublesome. And when it comes to a perennial plant like blackberry, the most troublesome weeds are perennial weeds. And you want to eliminate these before you plant. I have a note here about herbicides. I am not a fan of herbicides. I tend to focus on organic production practices whenever possible. But there are some settings where a farmer might consider using herbicides. There are other ways to manage perennial weeds as well. Cover cropping, for example, or a process called occultation, where you actually exclude light from the soil to help eliminate weeds over a period of time. So, there are various ways that you can control weeds, but it's very important to get these perennial troublesome weeds under control before you plant. And if you look at that picture there, those of you who are acquainted with that weed are immediately groaning because that is Bermuda grass. And Bermuda grass is a very troublesome weed if it's present in a blackberry planting. All right, now let's talk a little bit about where you're going to get your new plants to start your blackberry planting. And there are several different types of plant material that you can use. Many of us will start by purchasing plant material from a nursery. And that's a great way to do it. You can use tissue culture plugs. There's a couple of pictures there. You can also purchase root cuttings or rooted suckers or tip layers to start a planting. But you can also propagate your own blackberries, especially on a small scale. So let's watch another video. Okay, can we see this,
Yes.
Hannah? Okay, very
Yeah.
good. I'm Patrick Byers, horticulture field specialist with University of Missouri Extension. Let's talk about propagating blackberries. Now, for a few blackberries in a home planting, there's a number of different options that a home gardener can practice, and one of those is a process called tip layering. Certain types of blackberries produce long primicanes. Those primicanes grow an entire season, and then they begin to arch and head for the ground. And where the tips of those primicanes touch the ground, if those tips are buried, they can actually produce a new plant at that point. So let's take a look at this particular shoot, which tip layered for us. So the shoot grew down last year, and when it contacted the ground down here, we buried the tip of the shoot. And now notice that we have a small primicane growing from where that tip was buried. So when I come in here and dig this up and excavate it, we'll have a new plant, complete with a root system. I will cut the shoot at this point and then move this plant to its new home. Another way to propagate a small number of blackberry plants is to use root cuttings. And several different types of blackberries propagate quite nicely from root cuttings. So the root cuttings are dug while the plants are dormant. Get down here and see if we can find some cuttings. Some blackberry roots. Now this is a good size for a blackberry root cutting, and typically the cuttings will be about this diameter, and we want the cuttings to be about 4 to 6 inches long. So this is a good size for a cutting. Now these cuttings can be planted in the garden where you want the new plants to grow, or they can be planted in pots and covered with about 3/4 of an inch of a growing media, and they will generate a new plant. Blackberries are easy to propagate by digging up rooted suckers. Suckers arise some distance away from the original plant. Here we have an example of a sucker growing between the two plants that we originally planted. And so we'll go ahead and dig that sucker up. And we'll move it to its new spot in the garden. Commercial blackberry plantings are typically started from tissue culture plugs. These are small plants. They're produced under laboratory conditions, and generally they've been produced from plants that are virus tested to make sure that they're as free from viruses as possible. All right. Again, if you have any questions relative to propagation, please put them in the chat, and we will tackle them.
That was a really great video. I have a question.
Yes.
How can you tell if the blackberry plant is dormant?
So dormant plants, and yeah, that video was a little misleading because I shot all of that here in the past few days. But normally you would dig root cuttings in late February or early March, when the plants, before they begin to break bud and leaf out. And then those root cuttings can then be planted in the garden in their new spot. You want to plant them horizontally and cover them with about an inch of soil. Or as I mentioned in the video, you can also plant them in containers and pots and grow them out. And then when you're sure they're going to grow, you can transplant them at that point into the garden.
Awesome. There's a question in the chat from
Yes.
Laura Smith. If you don't dig up the suckers, do you run the risk of choking out the other plants?
Yeah, so if you don't dig up the suckers on hedgerow type blackberries, they will eventually fill in, and you can end up having a row that's fairly dense. And part of the pruning practice on hedgerow type brambles is to thin the row out a bit. There's always some shoots, some of the primicanes from the previous year that are weak and spindly. Those can be pruned out. You typically want about 2 to 3 shoots per running foot of row, and anything else, prune out the weaker shoots and get to that point. You're correct. You don't want too dense of a hedgerow. Do we have any other questions?
It looks like that's all for now.
Okay. So again, we're going to make sure that if we're buying plants, that they're virus tested. Blackberries tend to accumulate viruses over time. And if you transplant plants from an old blackberry planting, you run the risk of bringing virus-infested plants into your new blackberry planting. But if you purchase plants from a reputable nursery that have been through a virus testing program, that's the gold standard as far as starting a new blackberry planting, because hopefully there'll be no viruses in those plants. We typically plant dormant plants in late March through early April. And right now we're moving into the point where we're going to be planting tissue culture plants, which are actively growing. If you remember that flat I was holding with those little plants, I've been nurturing those plants for about a month now, moving them into and out of the house as on frosty nights. But the next few weeks look like we're out of the risk of frost, and I'm ready to plant those blackberries.
There's a question from Joel Sanders.
Yes.
On propagating suckers, they have a full life, 7 years after propagation?
Yes, as you propagate these, if there are no issues with viruses, that new plant that you've moved has at least a 7 to 12 year life ahead of it.
Okay. And Jean Delepsy says, if using catalytic tubs, can they overwinter?
Yes, if you're growing blackberries in containers, blackberries are reasonably cold tolerant. And the volume of a 15 to 20 gallon salt tub or lick tub is such that there's enough volume there that it won't get cold enough to damage their root systems. I've grown blueberries and blackberries in tubs for a number of years and have not experienced any cold damage on those plants.
Ben T asks, do you have recommendations on where to purchase bulk quantities for commercial production?
Yes, I do. And at the end of the presentation, there is a resource that Cornell University has put together. It's a berry nursery resource. It's updated annually. And there's a section on that related to blackberry cultivars that gets very specific as far as which nursery sources have various cultivars of blackberry available for sale. With the interest in tissue culture plugs, again, that's typically where most commercial farmers are going to purchase their blackberry propagation material. There's nurseries that specialize in that. There's a nursery called AgriStarts, for example, that is producing a number of different blackberry cultivars. And another nursery called Norse Farm, which has tissue culture blackberry starts available, and a nursery called Indiana Berry Company that too has blackberries that are tissue cultured available for sale. Okay. Any other questions, Hannah?
That's all in the questions.
Okay. So as far as planting your blackberry planting with the erect types, 8 to 10 feet between the rows is recommended, and 2 to 4 feet between plants. Semi-erect types, 10 to 12 feet between rows. They're a little bit larger plant, and 6 feet between the plants. Here in Missouri, because we have the risk of erosion, we're a climate that gets rainfall, it's important to maintain the planting so that you don't lose soil to erosion. One way to do that is to plant the row middles with a non-competitive, non-invasive grass. Make sure that you have enough space between the rows if you're going to be getting an ATV down or a tractor down between the rows. And then as soon as you plant, water and get your plants off to a good start. Irrigation is important, as I mentioned earlier, and commercial scale blackberry plantings are generally irrigated with drip or trickle systems, and this works well in home gardens too. Drip systems make very efficient use of the water that you have available, and it puts the water exactly where you want it, which is at the soil. It doesn't throw it up into the air. where it's lost to evaporation, and it doesn't get your blackberry plants wet, which leads to more disease issues. 1.5 to 2 inches of water per week is the recommendation. With a drip system, if you're using the type that has emitters that are embedded or molded in during the manufacturing process, use the types that have emitters every 18 to 24 inches. And then combine this with mulches, and you'll be in a good situation from the standpoint of irrigating your blackberries. Nutrition. The soil test will help guide you. Hopefully before you've planted, you've added any nutrients that have been that the soil test report notes are in short supply, especially phosphorus and potassium. But after the plants are growing, it's important to fertilize them annually as well. And this, again, is based upon your soil test, but it's also on a commercial scale planning based upon foliar samples, where the farmer will collect blackberry leaves, dry them, send them to a lab for analysis, and then the analysis report comes back and it tells you exactly how many nutrients are in your plant, what level. And this is extremely valuable because there can be situations where you have soil levels that look good, but if they're not getting into the plant, you're not seeing the benefit. So on foliar testing, you're going to be sampling the fully expanded leaves from the primocanes. And that, you can see my hand there is holding a leaf from a primocane. For a floricane fruiting types, you collect in late July to early August. For primocane fruiting types, you collect as they start to bloom. And then these leaves are submitted to a lab for testing. And here would be an example of a foliar test report. And again, it comes back with levels that are either sufficient, or it might come back with a level that is deficient or a level that is in excess. And looking at that information, you can then modify the way you're fertilizing your blackberries to supply what might be needed. Okay, so fertilizing blackberries, the main nutrient that blackberries need is nitrogen. And generally, because they're high-yielding plants, and also because we tend to prune them heavily and remove nitrogen when we prune a blackberry, it's important to replace this every year. And the recommended rate is about 80 to 100 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre. And of course, this can be applied with various forms of fertilizer, including organic fertilizers. Other nutrients, they're applied as indicated by soil and foliar tests. So in other words, you may not need phosphorus or potassium or micronutrients every year. You may not need them at all, or you may just need them as your soil and your foliar tests indicate. And then generally we fertilize as growth begins in the spring, about now. And it can be a good practice with blackberries to take what they need for the whole season, that 80 to 100 pounds, and break that into periodic applications. Because putting it all down at once may not be the most effective and efficient way to get nutrients into the plant. It may be better to apply it at 2-week intervals from now until sometime in late August, and supply nitrogen as the plant needs it over the growing season. Now, again, weed control can be a challenge in blackberries. And if we look at this picture, this is the typical way that weeds are managed. You can see, first of all, that we have a non-competitive grass in the middle. In this case, this is a turf-type fescue. You could also use orchard grass or, again, some other non-competitive grass. Within the row, if you have a good, healthy, vigorous stand of blackberries, they're pretty competitive against weeds within the row. And then along the edge of the row is where we have to pay particular attention. You'll notice it's a little hard to see here, but there's that zone between the plants and the grassy middle. And in this case, it's mulched. And we have to renew that mulch to keep weeds from moving into the row. You want to be cautious about cultivation around blackberries because the roots are fairly shallow. And if you damage the roots with tillage, you open them up for soil-borne diseases and other problems. Another way to manage weeds is to use weed barrier fabric. And we have a shot coming up a little bit later of a trellis showing weed barrier fabric. And this is becoming pretty popular with brambles. It's very easy to use it on clump-forming brambles, but even on hedgerow-forming types, we're now using it and seeing some huge benefits. And I mentioned herbicides there. Again, for organic farmers, herbicides are not an option, but there are very effective ways to control weeds without resorting to herbicides. Now, I mentioned that there can be some pest issues on blackberries. We should mention these. It's good to have an IPM or an integrated pest management plan in place, okay? And this is just as applicable to a home garden as it is to a blackberry farm. Okay, the first step is to establish the plan. You need to understand what the pests are that you would expect and that you see. Make sure that you monitor carefully and frequently. You want to be out looking at your blackberries several times a week. And if you're like me, I'm out in my blackberries every day looking at them just because I like blackberries. But also, I'm watching for the first signs of pests. I'm also watching for beneficials. In my garden, I try to encourage beneficial insects by maintaining habitat areas around the garden. And so things such as ladybugs, praying mantises, lacewings, pirate bugs, the other beneficial insects that I want present, I can help foster their populations by maintaining habitat for them. We also want to determine an action threshold. You know, if I see one stink bug in my blackberries, that's probably not a big deal. Okay, I can just go out, grab that stink bug and squish it. On the other hand, if I'm seeing a cloud of Japanese beetles descending upon my blackberries, I'm probably at a point where I need to take some action. So again, we want to understand just a few insect issues may not be a big deal. But if we start to see numbers building, then we need to take action. Then we want to look carefully at what our management strategies are. And, you know, if we were to look historically at managing pests, it was sort of the nuclear option. We see a pest, we go out and we spray for it. But there are many other tactics, many other strategies that we have at our disposal to help manage problems. Strategies like choosing the right cultivar of blackberries. Some blackberries are disease resistant. Those are great ones to choose. We want to do what we can to foster the population of beneficial insects. We want to develop a blackberry planting that doesn't favor disease problems. We want to use practices like proper pruning and moving diseased parts of the plants away from the planting to help as well. And then we want to use strategies like trapping harmful insects rather than spraying pesticides. And if we do have to resort to pesticides, let's use, first of all, organic pesticides that are soft on predators, and let's use pesticides that are very specific as far as targeting the pests that we're dealing with. And then we want to evaluate the plan to make sure that it's doing what we want it to do. So here are some blackberry problems that we see. Now, the ones that are in bold are the ones that we expect every year. Anthracnose is a common disease issue on blackberries. And on the insect side, spotted-winged Drosophila, Japanese beetles, and stink bugs, we expect them every year. These other problems can show up, and it's useful to be able to recognize them, but I'm not going to focus on these for today. We'll just talk about anthracnose, and then we'll talk about some insect issues. So anthracnose is a fungal disease, and oftentimes you see it first on the primicanes, and we'll see that here in a moment, but you see these little circular spots on the stems, okay? It becomes a problem, though, when we see it on the fruit, and I'll show it to you here in the next picture, but the fruit can actually fail or shrivel, and it does affect the eating quality of the berries that are infected with anthracnose. It overwinters in the winter on the old shoots. Very important to prune out floricanes after harvest as soon as possible because the disease starts on floricanes. So prune out floricanes when you're done picking the berries off of those floricanes. And then by doing that, you'll help with that problem of it spreading to the primicanes the next spring. So if you look at that upper picture, you can see a light case of anthracnose on a berry. Sometimes the whole berry looks like those brown drupelets and it's lost. And the other picture there, you'll notice that's a primicane that has anthracnose spots on it. So again, for managing anthracnose, we'll talk about here in a moment, prune out floricanes as soon as harvest is done. Make sure you get them out of the planting. Make sure that you prune out any floricanes during the dormant season that you missed. And then consider using a delayed dormant fungicide. And as far as the organic options, there are some copper-containing fungicides that are allowed. There's also a fungicide called lime sulfur, which some organic certifiers will allow. If you're a conventional farmer, there are other fungicides to use too. The main insect issue on blackberries is spotted-winged Drosophila. And this is a fruit fly. You can see the pictures there. There's the upper picture is well, actually, they're both pictures of the female. And on the lower picture, if you look carefully at the end of her abdomen, you can see her ovipositor looks like a little hacksaw. And what she does is she saws into the berry just as it begins to ripen. She lays her eggs. And then if you look at that picture over on the right, you see that small white organism there in the berry. That's the maggot of the spotted-winged Drosophila. You'll notice too that berry is very soft. It's losing quality quickly. At the center there, you can see some spotted-winged Drosophila adults. You can see how tiny they are. But if you have them, you will know it, because when you pick the berries, they're soft. And particularly for commercial farmers, it's a serious issue to, if you're marketing berries that have the spotted wing Drosophila larvae in them, it's a real problem. Now, how do we manage spotted wing Drosophila? We know a bit about the life cycle. This is a new insect in Missouri. It's an invasive insect that's only been with us since 2013. But we've learned that, first of all, it does not overwinter in large numbers. So early in the season, there's not very many of them. And if you focus on growing blackberries that ripen in June, you'll have fewer problems from spotted wing Drosophila because the numbers don't start increasing till late June and July. So you might focus on early ripening blackberries, and we'll talk about those when we talk about cultivars. You can trap for spotted wing Drosophila, and that's helpful. Keep your berries picked. Don't let berries get overripe. In other words, pick them frequently and regularly. In a home planting, as soon as you pick blackberries, they need to go into the refrigerator, because refrigerating the berries will stop development of the larvae. Now, if you eat a berry that has a spotted wing Drosophila larva in it, are you going to get sick? No. There's no evidence that eating the larva is a health risk. Now, if you know they're in there and you're eating them, there might be some other reasons not to do it. But quite frankly, those of us who have eaten blackberries in the past 3 or 4 years have probably eaten unknowingly some spotted wing Drosophila larvae. If you freeze the berries, it kills the larva. If you cook with the berries, the larvae break down and they're not a problem. The main issue with spotted wing Drosophila, again, is that it causes berries to lose quality quickly, and for commercial farmers, it has to be managed. Now, the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide, which I show here, has a section on managing blackberry pests, and this is useful for farmers who are thinking about growing blackberries. There's great information in this for home gardeners as well, talking about different pests and their life cycles and when they should be controlled. So the guide is available online. The link is there. And before I forget, I will be sending this presentation out to everyone who's on the meeting today. So you'll have these resources, but you can access the guide online and look at it whenever you want. You can also get hard copies from your local extension office. Now, what would a routine blackberry spray program look like? Delay dormant, that's typically going to be a spray sometime in March before the blackberries begin to grow, using a fungicide like lime sulfur or a copper-containing fungicide will help with anthracnose. A spray at bloom, this is strictly a fungicide spray, not an insecticide spray, but a fungicide spray is helpful against anthracnose. Cover sprays after bloom will help with managing anthracnose and then those diseases like stink bug and Japanese beetle. Both stink bugs and Japanese beetles become problems in June. And so that's when you want to start thinking about those. And then as we get into harvest, using insecticides to help manage spotted wing Drosophila and Japanese beetles is helpful. But again, this is not a very intensive spray program. It's generally manageable. There are organic options, both for fungicides and insecticides, to incorporate into a spray program like this. Other sprays, redneck cane borer or crown borer sprays might be in order if those problems are present. Again, this is primarily for commercial farmers, and then sprays for orange rust, Phytophthora, and broad mite. Okay, any questions in the chat before we move just into a general overview of activities?
There are currently no questions. Joel Sanders, okay. Joel Sanders asks about thrips.
Thrips can be an issue on blackberries, but generally not at the level where any sort of spray is warranted. Again, if you keep the blackberries harvested regularly and then refrigerate them as soon as they're harvested, that will help reduce any issue related to thrips that might be in the ripe berries. But in general, blackberries are not particularly prone to thrips.
That's all that on the chat.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's take just a quick overview of activities in a blackberry planting. And so we're going to kind of go through the seasons with blackberries, and we'll start with March. In March, blackberries start to grow. Okay, we see movement of carbohydrates from their root systems up into the floricanes, and then the floricanes will begin to break bud in late March and April. So as far as what you need to get done at this point, if you didn't do your pruning when they're dormant, you better get it done in March. Okay, this is when you're going to apply that dormant season application of lime sulfur. This is also a great time to get out there and get those weeds under control. As we move into April, we begin to see primocane emergence, and we began to see the development of the first flower clusters. If you went out and looked at blackberries now, you would see flower clusters. And then in a more typical year, the flowering would begin around the end of April, but we're going to be a little bit delayed this year because of cool weather. If you're a farmer, this is when you're going to fertilize, home gardener too. If you're bringing beehives in, you're going to place them as the first flowers open on your blackberries. Primocane management, as the primocanes begin to grow and we move into May, you're going to be pinching the tips of those primocanes, and then weed control. And then in May, we see flowering and fruit development, and it's just a time of anticipation as those berries get bigger and bigger. Weed control, and at the end of May is when you start to think about spotted-winged Drosophila control. Again, they're not a serious issue until we move into late June, but you want to be out there watching for them as the berries begin to ripen. June, July, and August. So June is when our harvest season begins in Missouri. And the very earliest ripening blackberries here in Southwest Missouri will ripen around June 10th. It's a little bit later in central and northern Missouri. We begin to see lateral shoot developments on the primocanes. And then if we're growing primocane types, we begin to see primocane flowering as we move into late July, and then primocane fruit development. The floricane fruit harvest will continue into July and early August. And as soon as we're done picking fruit off of the primocanes, then it's time, on the floricanes, then it's time to prune those floricanes out. You'll notice that's the job down there in August. If you're growing primocane fruiting blackberries, they'll begin to ripen fruit in late July, August, and then into September. As we move into the late summer and fall, we want to, again, make sure that we get those spent floricanes pruned out. We're going to be enjoying the harvest on our primocanes, assuming it hasn't gotten too hot. And then as we move into the fall, then the plants begin to harden off in anticipation of winter. Now, oftentimes the primocane harvest will continue into October until we have our first frost. But once we get that first hard frost in October, that's the end of the line as far as blackberry harvest. And then our attention turns towards the hardening off of those plants and getting them ready for winter. And then in the winter, our plants are dormant. They look like nothing's happening, but we're beginning to see flower bud initiation on floricane fruiting types. And then the plants begin to accumulate their chilling hours. Most blackberries have to go through a cool period before they'll break bud normally the next spring. And then the main activity during the winter, again, is to get those plants pruned. And that's primarily a January and February job. On the subject of pruning, when we talk about blackberries and the floricane fruiting types, as the primocanes grow in late May, they will reach easily 3 to 4 feet in height by the end of May. And at that point, we want to cut the tip off the primocane so that we encourage side branch formation. And if you look carefully at this picture, you'll notice that those shoots have side branches. And the reason they have side branches is because we cut the tip off of that primocane the previous growing season, okay? In the early spring, we come back in and we do our dormant season pruning. Again, as that diagram showed earlier, sometime typically in February. And we'll shorten back the laterals, and then we take out any dead shoots that are still there that we missed last summer. And then we can thin out the row if it's too thick. Now, if we're growing primocane blackberries, they're a little bit different. They're going to be having fruit on the tips of the primocanes, and we'll enjoy that crop. And then we need to make a decision. Do we want to have a second crop on that shoot when it becomes a floricane in the second year? If that's the case, we cut the tips off because the part that had fruit on the previous fall will die back. We'll cut that off, and then we'll enjoy fruit on those shoots then during the more normal floricane season. Or some people will just cut the shoots back to the ground during the winter and then just enjoy the late summer and fall crop without worrying about cropping those shoots when they're floricanes.
Patrick, I have a question in regards to the cutting.
Yes.
When cutting, do you want to cut at an angle?
So when you're pruning blackberries and for example, when you're tipping the primocanes, if you're growing a floricane fruiting type, yes, cut at a little bit of an angle to shed water off that tip. When you're pruning the spent floricanes, or when you're doing your dormant season pruning, you're generally removing entire shoots. And so at that point, it's not really as important that you worry about the angle of the cut. And when you're shortening back the laterals, again, those are going to be cuts that are more or less vertical cuts. You're not going to be as concerned about water on those cuts either.
I see.
Okay, now for growing semi-erect cultivars, those are the types that are more like vines. When their primicanes get to the top of whatever you're tying them to, then you cut the tip off. And then they will develop these strong, vigorous side shoots, laterals, that you can then tie to your support. During the dormant season, you'll select 8 to 10 of the strongest shoots, and you'll remove any weak shoots and then tie everything to the appropriate part of the trellis. And on the subject of a trellis. So a trellis is basically a way to help you modify the way blackberries grow to make it easier to manage them. You can control the height of your blackberries. You can also control the spread of the canes, and you can control productivity. It makes managing them easier. It can actually stimulate those lateral shoots that we want to see. It's a useful way to monitor the way they grow and thin out weak canes. You can also improve your insect and disease control by growing on a trellis. It makes harvest easier, and it makes harvest more fun. So let's take a look at some trellis type approaches. There's 3 basic trellis designs, and these are kind of going in order of complexity. 2-wire trellis, very easy. A supported hedgerow trellis, a bit more complicated but doable. And then the rotating cross-arm trellis, which is a complicated system, but it has some definite benefits. So let's take a quick look at each one of these. So here is a 2-wire trellis, and it's basically like that picture we saw earlier. It's like a post that has a wire that's about 6 feet off the ground, and then a second wire that's about 4 feet off the ground. And then we're going to be tying the blackberry laterals, the primicanes and the laterals, to this trellis. Now, this doesn't do a very good job of separating the primicanes from the floricanes because we just have one plane in which to tie. But this is a simple trellis to build, and it does a nice job of holding the plants up. So again, here's some examples, and you can see with upright types or with the semi-erect types. The advantages: it's easy to build, economical. It doesn't do a particularly good job of dividing the canopy. The plants are still pretty crowded, and we can have some increased disease and insect issues with this type compared to other types. And it is more difficult to harvest the berries because they're mixed in amongst the primicanes as well as the foliage of the floricanes. So here's what it would look like. This is the picture I wanted to show you, the weed barrier fabric on the ground around the plants. And again, I'm seeing more and more plantings, both in home gardens and also on blackberry farms, that are using weed barrier fabric to control weeds. And you can see how beautifully it does the weed management under the canopy of the plants. So I'm a fan of this. I use weed barrier fabric on my farm now in several settings. The supported hedgerow trellis is the next step up as far as complexity. It does a great job of separating the floricanes from the primicanes, and it's still reasonably economical to build. It allows better light penetration into the canopy. You get better yields, better air circulation. You also get better coverage with any insecticides or fungicides that you might be doing. It costs a bit more, though, than a simple 1 or 2 wire trellis. So here's some examples, and with this one, you can see the posts have cross arms, and there's wires on those cross arms that go down on the outside of the row. And with this approach, the primicanes are tied onto one side of the row, and the floricanes are tied onto the other side. And so, in other words, just half of the row is actually producing fruit in any given year. But it does make the fruit very easy to harvest. And then when you're spraying, for example, if you're spraying spotted wing Drosophila spray, you just have to worry about half of the row where the fruit is. Here's another example. We're looking down the row, and you can see very clearly that on one side of the trellis, this is the picture on the right, you have the floricanes tied. On the other side, the primicanes tied. Now, the shift trellis or the rotating cross-arm trellis is more complicated because we actually move the orientation of the trellis based upon the point during the blackberry growth cycle. And so with this type here, and again, if you have questions about the shift trellis, I'm going to encourage you to reach out to me individually, and we can talk about it because it's a little hard just to show in slides, and I don't have any good video on this. I will say that if you go on YouTube and check out the shift of the rotating cross-arm trellis, there are some videos there that help illustrate how it moves, but the orientation of the trellis shifts during different times of the blackberry growth cycle. The advantage of the shift trellis, all the fruit's on one side, and if you do this properly, the fruit actually ripens in the shade of the canopy so that you have fewer problems with sun scald. And then you can take the trellis and lay it down on the ground and cover it up for winter protection. So there's some definite benefits to using this trellis. Disadvantage, it's expensive and it's also management intensive. I have seen some home gardeners who are working with it. I have seen some commercial scale plantings here in Missouri as well. But there's definitely a learning curve that needs to be climbed to become good at managing the shift trellis. So the components, you typically have a cross arm, and that's the arm, if you look at the picture on the left, where the fruiting side of the trellis is, and it's generally about 6 feet into the air, and there's usually 3 wires that go down, 3 or 4 wires that go down that arm. And we tie the floricanes to that arm. And then there's a short arm on the other side, and you can see that in the picture there as well, that has 1 or 2 wires, and that's where the primicanes are tied initially. You can see them growing up and over. Again, we very effectively have separated the floricanes on one side and the primicanes on the other. That floricane wall is typically on the north side or the east side of the trellis, so that when the berries ripen, they're in the shade of the canopy. In the winter, we lay it down like we see here, and we cover it with floating row cover to protect it from winter cold. During the spring, we raise it up to a horizontal position like this. The flower clusters pop up on the floricanes, and all the flowers are pointing up. They set, and then when you take the whole canopy and you shift it up to the upright position, as we see here. And then all the fruit will then be on that side of the canopy. It's very impressive to see these systems because you have a solid wall of berries. It's very easy to harvest the berries. They're all in that plane. They're also in the shade of the canopy so that they're protected from sun scald. And the picking experience is very pleasant too, because you're picking in the shade of the canopy. Do we have a question, Hannah?
We do. Joel Sanders asks, is shift trellis only for trailing cultivators?
The shift trellis works really well with semi-erect types of blackberries like Triple Crown, but it's also adapted for the upright types too. You just have to manipulate the way they grow. And we just don't have enough time today to get into details on this. So if you'd like more information, please reach out to me directly. And I have a number of resources that I can share. I'm also coming off of 4 years of managing a shift trellis blackberry planting, so I have some personal experience to share there as well.
That's all on the questions.
Okay, very good. Now, as far as blackberry harvest, the harvest season in Missouri is from mid-June through August with the floricane crop, and from August until first hard frost with the primicane crop. Berries need to be harvested when they're fully ripe. We'll go into more detail on that in the second presentation. They need to be picked at least twice a week, and during warm periods, you may have to pick 3 times a week. Pick your fruit in the morning when it's cool and dry. You don't want to pick before the dew dries off, but you do want to pick before it gets warm. So most blackberry harvest is generally done in the morning, and then you want to try to be finished by around 10 o'clock. If you're a farmer picking blackberries, pick directly into the sales container. If you're a pick-your-own farmer, blackberries are typically harvested into 1-gallon plastic pails that have a plastic bag liner. And this is a great way to keep your, to maximize harvest. It's also a great way from the standpoint of produce food safety to keep those blackberries from contacting the inside surfaces of a bucket, which may be dirty. That single-use plastic bag liner is a great way to work with produce food safety on pick-your-own farms. Now, again, these next few slides are kind of focused on commercial scale production. So those of you who are home gardeners, bear with me. But for those farmers who are thinking about blackberries, it is a labor-intensive crop. You need to have sufficient help at harvest time. It's going to take about 15 to 20 pickers to get an acre of blackberries harvested at peak harvest in 1 day's time. Pick your own is a great way to manage harvest, but make sure that you have enough population in your area. There is an excellent online tool developed by the University of Missouri Extension called the Agri-Intel tool. And this tool gives you an idea of what your population is relative to where your farm is. Lots of other information too, as far as things such as the site of farmers markets and other people who are growing similar crops in your area. So check out the Ag Intel tool. Again, I wish we had little more time and we would go through an exercise with that. But it is important to understand what's going on in your area if you're thinking about planting blackberries, particularly for pick your own. Blackberries are perishable and they should be marketed quickly after harvest. As soon as they're harvested, they need to be cooled down and they should be stored at around 32 degrees Fahrenheit. You have about a 7-day shelf life if you cool them immediately upon harvest and hold them at 32 degrees. But it's best to market them as quickly as possible. If you're a home gardener, pick them, get them into the refrigerator, and again, enjoy them as soon as possible. If you're going to freeze them or otherwise process them, try to process them within a day of harvest. Lots of options for marketing blackberries. They're perfect for pick your own. There's, as I said before, a nearly insatiable demand for local blackberries in a pre-picked form at roadside stands, on-farm markets, farmers markets, or CSAs. And we're seeing interest in locally grown blackberries from larger scale markets as well. Produce auctions, food hubs, institutions, grocery stores, restaurants. I had a conversation recently with one of the people who buys produce for the Cox Hospital system. They mentioned how interested they were in local grown blackberries. And then blackberries are definitely a good candidate for value added, where you can make jellies and sauces, juices, wines, dried or frozen blackberries for sales beyond the blackberry season. It's going to cost about $6,000 to $10,000 per acre to establish a new blackberry planting. But again, recognize that you do have some significant upfront investment before the planting begins to generate revenue. Your payback period with blackberries is about 4 to 5 years. My experience has been it's probably about 4 years from the initial investment to where you pay back that initial investment. There's some excellent enterprise budgets out there to help guide you in establishing a blackberry planting. But again, you want to have a good handle on finances anytime you're thinking about specialty crop production. And be sure to utilize these tools. They can be very helpful. Here are some tools. I checked the links earlier, and the Arkansas link, unfortunately, is broken. But if you do a search with University of Arkansas, they've developed some very helpful enterprise budgets for berry crops. And hopefully the blackberry one will be back up again soon. There's some excellent resources out there. University of Missouri has some great guides among their extension guides. The Estate Fruit Experiment Station, which is a branch of Missouri State University, has some excellent guides as well available on their website. Here's the nursery listing guide that I promised. It's revised annually. It's just an excellent resource when you're sourcing particular blackberry cultivars. The Cornell University berry site has a lot of great information on growing blackberries as well. And Cornell has also developed an excellent organic blackberry production site as well. So check that out. And then the USDA ATRA site has some great resources on organic berry production too. So those both warrant checking out if you're interested in organic blackberry production. So that is our first presentation. Let's pause for just a moment now. If anyone has any questions, please type them into the chat and we will have a question and answer period here before we get into our second presentation. So do we have any questions, Hannah?
So far we do not. That was a lovely video.
Oh, thank you.
About how many acres do you have shift trellises on your property?
So the planting that I worked with is actually a research demonstration planting that we had at the University of Missouri Southwest Center in Mount Vernon. And it was about 1/5 of an acre, not very large, but large enough to demonstrate the technology. And we managed it for 4 years. So we saw the establishment year and then 3 years of crop on that planting. And it was just very, very impressive at how productive those systems are. We typically harvested about 5 pounds of berry per running foot of row with the shift trellis, which equates to somewhere around 25 pounds of blackberries per plant. They were planted 5 feet apart.
Laura Smith asks, on the topic of trellis, what would you recommend for trellis material for growing in buckets?
So if you're growing in buckets, probably a good way to manage the blackberries in that setting would be something similar to a tomato cage or a piece of woven wire that you could put around part of the bucket. If the buckets were in a place where you're going to leave them, more or less for a long-term period of time, you could build a trellis that was actually independent of the containers and then train the plants to that adjacent trellis. And in that setting, you could use something like cattle panels or some other supported wire structure to tie them to.
In regards to bucket growing blackberries, what substance do you put below for aeration? Do you put rocks below?
So I think the question may be referring to the bottom of the what the container is setting on.
That's correct.
And a couple of things to point out here. If you're going to set them directly on the soil, make sure that the holes for drainage in the container are on the sides of the container, because you're correct, you can actually seal off the drainage holes and run into problems there. I like to set my containers on something that is going to be weed resistant. So, if they're setting on the soil, I'll put a layer of landscape fabric under the containers. If they're setting on a hard surface like a concrete patio or a brick patio or something like that, then I like to actually support them off the surface of whatever that might be. So put them on bricks, for example, or some sort of a wire stand to give a little bit of an air break underneath the container. But yes, I do like to have the containers up off the soil if at all possible.
That's great. That's it on the questions in the chat. However, I had a question in regards to bee boxes and blackberry production. So in addition to having plants around the blackberries that encourage growth and warding off pests, how far away do you want bee boxes?
Well, so blackberries are a native North American fruit, and they have developed in concert with our native pollinators. And so if you could develop habitat for native pollinators, and there's some excellent resources available from MU Extension and the Missouri Department of Conservation doing just that. If you can develop habitat for native pollinators, particularly in home gardens, oftentimes your native pollinators will be there in sufficient numbers to accomplish pollination. And again, there's just a number of different insects that are effective blackberry pollinators. But if you want to foster pollinator numbers, you can bring in bee boxes, you can bring in honeybee hives. The closer they are to your blackberries, the better. And particularly if you were bringing in bee boxes for some of our native pollinators, like those solitary type bees. And right now, I'm drawing a blank as far as specific species, but bring those in and place those close to the blackberry planting as well. But if you go out when blackberries are flowering, you'll be just blown away by the number of pollinators that are present there and the diversity of species.
That's great. That's it on the questions in the chat.
Okay, let's go ahead and move into our second presentation. Again, please, anyone at any time, if you have a question, type it into the chat and we will address it. Okay, so this next presentation, as I'm bringing it up, is focused on cultivars, and there's always lots of interest in the best blackberry to plant. And when I think about the best blackberry, of course, there are a number of things that are important, but we want to think first of all about overall adaptation to our part of the world. We also want to think about disease resistance. We want to think about the characteristics of the plant, and especially thorniness if you're considering a thorny blackberry, and we want to think about fruit characteristics. So these are all things that we should consider. So let's take a quick look at blackberry cultivars. And again, I want to acknowledge Springfield Community Gardens and the USDA as our funder for these workshops. And I want to particularly thank Dr. John Clark. I had a chance to hang out with John at a meeting back in March. Took this picture there. He and I are acquaintances of long standing. And John has directed the blackberry breeding program at the University of Arkansas for, going on 30 years now. And he is personally responsible for many of these blackberries that are so popular today in both home gardens and also on blackberry farms. So hats off to John and the work that he's done at the University of Arkansas in developing blackberries to benefit the rest of us.
Patrick, there's a question from Lori Stillwell.
Yes.
Do you make visits to local farms to help a person evaluate their potential for growing ability?
Yes, I do. Again, unfortunately, during this COVID-19 situation, I'm sheltering in place and I'm not able to do that. I'm happy to do virtual visits where we can get in touch via Zoom or telephone and talk about what's going on at your farm. I've even worked in situations where people have walked around with their tablet or their cell phone and show me videos and discuss what they'd like to do. And hopefully when we get past the COVID crisis and things return to normal, I would be thrilled to come out and visit your farm. I'm very excited to work with people who are considering Blackberry production. And again, please reach out to me. My contact information is in the presentations. Okay, so again, thinking about Blackberry cultivars, we'll touch briefly on Blackberry types. We've already discussed that at some length. We'll talk about what we would like to see in a Blackberry variety, but then we'll spend most of our time talking about those varieties that are currently available, both thornless, thorny, and primocane types, and then a little bit on the semi-erect types. So again, we have different growth habits. We have the erect types, which are upright growing, both thorny and thornless types. They tend to be among the hardiest types of the blackberries. We have semi-erect types, and this is actually a shift trellis. You can see behind my friend Pat there, you can see that wall of berries that I mentioned. These types have to be trained to a trellis. These semi-erect types do. They're a little bit less hardy, but very productive. We have trailing types, which we don't grow here in Missouri. And I wanted to include this slide because frequently I'll get questions about Blackberry cultivars like boysenberry or marionberry. And these are fabulous blackberries, but they just are not hardy enough to endure the environment here in Missouri. And so these are best left to our friends and colleagues in the Pacific Northwest or California, where they grow beautifully. Now, as far as what we would like to see in a desirable Blackberry cultivar, again, from the standpoint of home production, we're not as concerned about marketing, but if you're growing them for a commercial crop, they need to be adapted to your marketing strategy. So typically we need to have characteristics such as firmness in the berries and the ability to hold them for a period of time after they've been harvested. Obviously, we want productive plants. Berry quality is very important. One of the ways that we compete as local berry growers is by producing quality fruit. We want to focus on those cultivars that have good quality. And I'm just thrilled at two new Blackberry cultivars, which we'll talk about here in a moment, the cultivars Cato and Ponca, which were developed at the University of Arkansas and released because they have outstanding blackberry flavor. They just are, they're the cat's meow as far as good blackberries. We want blackberries that have tolerance to high temperatures because we know it's going to get warm during the blackberry season here in Missouri. And also hardiness is important, and particularly as we move into a period of time where our climate seems to be a bit unsettled, we need blackberries that have wide adaptation, not just to high temperatures, but also to hardiness. Ripening season, it'd be nice to have early ripening blackberries from the standpoint of management of spotted-winged Drosophila, but there is some interest in late ripening blackberries to extend the harvest season. Disease resistance is important, and as I've said several times, the trend now is towards thornless blackberries because it's so much easier to manage thornless blackberries. So here are the recommended cultivars. We'll talk about each one of these here in a moment, but on the thornless side, and these are listed in order of ripening, Natchez, Ponca, Cato, Osage, Washita, Apache, and Navajo. There's still some interest in thorny blackberries. Chickasaw and Kiowa would be the two to consider. And then the primocane types, which we talked about again in some detail earlier. Primark 45 is among the best as far as quality and productivity, but it is thorny. Primark Freedom and Primark Traveler are both thornless primocane blackberries. So let's start with Natchez. Natchez was just a huge development when it was first released about 10 years ago. It's still under patent, which means that you have to pay a royalty if you buy Natchez plants, but it is worth every penny. It's the earliest ripening blackberry that we commonly grow as far as the floricane types. Good yields, large berries. These berries sometimes are 2 inches long, 8 to 9 grams. Anytime you see a berry size above 6 grams, it's a big berry. And if you see a berry size above 8 grams, it's a huge berry. Good quality fruit. Whenever you see a Brix rating, which is a rating of the amount of sugar, sweetness in the berry, above 7, that's a good sign. And some of these we'll see here a little bit later. Sometimes they're better than 11. But Natchez typically is at least 9.5 degrees Brix. One issue with Natchez is it does have susceptibility to anthracnose. and you'll want to be on top of managing anthracnose with natchez. It has good fruit storage potential, good handling potential. It's a huge berry, but it's relatively firm. Great berry for pick your own, and a great berry for direct market sales to farmers markets and possibly for institutions. Ponca is that new one that I mentioned. It ripens just after natchez and has good yields. Berries a little bit smaller than natchez, but look at the berry quality, 11 degrees Brix, and the flavor is outstanding on Ponca. Again, one of my favorite flavored blackberries. Good plant growth and hardiness. It has disease resistance. The berries are firmer than natchez, which means even better potential from the standpoint of holding and moving to a market like a farmer's market. So a good one to consider. It too is a patented berry. Cato is the other new one, just came out last year. Larger berries than Ponca, not quite as big as natchez, but still a very large berry in that 8 to 10 gram range. Wonderful fruit quality. Again, right up there with Ponca, just a delicious, delicious berry. Good fruit storage, good handling potential, good plant growth and hardiness, and it has disease resistance as well. So although we haven't grown Ponca and Cato to any extent, I'm excited about these two and would encourage people to consider planting them. Now, as they're new, perhaps you wouldn't want to plant an acre of Ponca or an acre of Cato, but plant at least a few if you're considering commercial scale. And if you're a home gardener, these two definitely need to be in your garden because they are just such tasty blackberries. Osage. This is a common theme. This is another tasty blackberry. It's been out a bit longer. Smaller size berry, 6 to 7 grams, but still adequate size. Good quality fruit. I have grown Osage. It's quite well adapted to our part of the world, particularly central and southern Missouri, and just an outstanding flavored berry. Over the years, I've done a number of taste tests with different blackberries to get a feel for what consumers prefer. And while Osage may not be the biggest berry, it is always at the top as far as preference on flavor. So a good one to consider. It is disease resistant and it has a good firm berry so that it handles and stores quite well. Ouachita. So Ouachita has been out a long time. It's a little bit smaller berry, quite productive. It's among the most productive of these upright thornless type blackberries. Good quality fruit. It has good resistance to diseases and especially anthracnose. It's more resistant to anthracnose, for example, than natchez is. It is quite firm, and of the ones we've talked about so far, probably has the best fruit storage and handling potential. So it's a good berry for pre-pick sales, or if you have to hold the berries for several days before selling. It's going to be a little bit later. It's a mid to late June, July cultivar. So up to this point, we've been talking about berries that primarily ripen or begin their harvest in the first 2 weeks of June. Ouachita will generally begin in the 3rd week of June. Apache. This is one that's been out a long time, no longer under patent. It's going to be a late June, but primarily a July ripening berry. Large berries. Look how large, 10 grams. Good quality. It has good fruit storage and handling potential, but it's a softer berry than the other ones that we've looked at. It's also ripening largely in July, so spotted-winged Drosophila is more of a problem on Apache just because of that. But it has good berry quality. It's a nice berry for pick-your-own sales. It can be used for pre-pick sales, farmers markets, and such. But again, it's a softer berry, more difficult to handle. And then we have Navajo, which has been out a long time. Navajo's been available for almost 30 years now, no longer under patent. It's a primarily July ripening berry. The berries are smaller. Notice it's a 5-gram berry, but it's very firm and has the best potential for longer term storage. And in fact, some of the studies have shown that you still have good fruit quality after 10 days of storage, which is just really, really remarkable for a blackberry. But again, it's a late ripening berry. Spotted-winged Drosophila is going to be more of a problem, and smaller berry size. But particularly for sales where you're going to need to hold these for long periods of time, this would be a good one to consider. Okay, so that ends the upright thornless types. And again, if you have any questions about any of them, please type it into the chat and we will tackle it. There are 2 thorny cultivars that might be considered if there's interest. Chickasaw is a very high yielding cultivar, and that probably is the only reason that you would want to plant a thorny blackberry is because of overall high yield. Good sized berries, 10 to 11 grams. It's a little bit lower in sugar content, but still a good quality berry. The fruit is not as firm at harvest. So again, there's that note there about storage and handling potential less than the thornless types. So that needs to be recognized. It is quite disease resistant and probably will be among the hardiest of the blackberries that are going to be among the ones we talk about today. But again, it is thorny. And then there's Kiowa. Kiowa has huge berries. Notice the size of those berries in that picture relative to that quarter. So it's a big berry. It has high yields. It is thorny, of course. Berries can be up to 13 grams in size, which is a remarkable sized blackberry. Good quality fruit, quite disease resistant, although it's mentioned there that it does show slight anthracnose, and it has good potential for handling and storage. So again, thorny type, no longer under patent, still grown to some extent. All right, any questions at this point, Hannah?
There are no questions right now.
Okay, so now we'll shift gears and talk about the primocane fruiting blackberries. This is a new development. The first ones came out about 10 years ago, and the first thornless types have been out about 7 years. There's excitement about these types, particularly among home gardeners. We have some commercial scale plantings, but again, recognize that in general, in a hot summer, they're going to be disappointing and likely not profitable in a commercial planting. And we can frequently have hot summers. So I'm cautioning you about planting primocane fruiting types on a commercial scale. So among the three that are recommended, Primark 45 is still under patent. It's a thorny type. It has a nice sized berry, as you can see in that one that I'm holding there, 6 to 7 grams in size, and just delicious flavor. It's a wonderful flavored berry. The harvest season is the typical primocane season in August and October. You can grow this for the floricane crop the next spring. It's early ripening. It ripens with Natchez, but again, it's thorny, so keep that in mind. It is a firm berry, and among the primocane fruiting types, it's among the firmest, and so it would have potential for holding and storing if we could grow it on a in a setting here that was commercially viable. But in general, for the home garden, it's an excellent berry to consider for a primocane type. Primark Freedom is a thornless type, still under patent, has huge berries. You'll notice, again, 9-gram berries. Look at that, my handful there. That's only 3 berries that I'm holding there. My daughters call these 2-bite berries because it takes 2 bites to eat a Primark Freedom berry. Harvest season is August to October. Good quality fruit, high sugar levels. The floricane crop, it has good yields. The berries are smaller. The floricane berries are smaller than the primocane berries. They won't be as impressive as you see in my hand there, but still reasonable size. Excellent berry for the home garden. Again, we're not recommending these for commercial scale production. And in fact, there have been some problems with winter hardiness on Primark Freedom here in Missouri. So plant it small scale in the home garden. Traveler is the third primocane type that I'll talk about. Thornless, it's under patent. It's an early ripening from the standpoint of the floricane crop, ripens with Natchez, and it's among the most productive as far as the floricane crop. The primocane crop ripens in August to October. Of the 3 primocane types, I like the flavor of Primark Traveler the best. I mean, they're all good, but the flavor is excellent. The berry size is 7 to 8 grams, so it's a nice size berry. You can see the quarter that I'm holding there as far as the size of the berries. The yields are good as far as the primocane crop in a year where the environmental conditions are favorable. This is a good one, again, for home gardeners, and it would be a good one on small scale, but recognize that in commercial scale plantings, there are going to be years where the yields will be disappointing in hot years. Now, semi-erect blackberries. There are 3 that are still grown. There are a number of other ones in this group that people still have in their plantings, but from the standpoint of performance, the 3 that are recommended are Triple Crown, Chester, and Loch Ness, and especially the first one there, Triple Crown. Now, let's talk a little bit about harvesting berries, especially with this type. Triple Crown and others, as a group, I will frequently get comments from people growing these that, well, they just are tart. They just don't taste as good as the berries harvested up the upright growing blackberries. And one of the reasons is that with this type of blackberry, they're a little bit later to develop sugar in the berry. Now keep in mind that flavor on blackberries is a complex mix of sugar, acidity, and various other aromatic type compounds that are present in the blackberry. Now, we can talk about sugar and acidity first. As blackberries ripen and they move from red to black, we see a building of sugar within the berries, okay? As these berries move during these stages of ripeness, we also see a decrease in the acidity. And at some point, there's a good spot to pick them where the sugar levels have built and there's still some acidity there to give us interest to the flavor. You know, a berry that has no acidity tastes flat, but a berry that has a good level of sugar and also some acidity tastes good. And then these cultivars like Osage and Cato and Ponca have this added punch of these aromatics to give that, you know, those really nice flavors as well. So it is important to pick berries at the right stage, and especially with the semi-erect types, we want to pick them as they move from the shiny black stage to the dull black stage. And looking at these pictures here, you can see the difference. Shiny black is just that, it's shiny. Dull black fruit, they look a little bit dusty, they look a little bit dull. Now, you have to recognize that as they move from shiny black to dull black, they start to soften. And especially if you're a commercial farmer thinking about blackberries and when to harvest, if you're going to be taking those berries and moving them some distance to a market, like a farmer's market, or if you're going to hold them for a period of time in the cooler, you're going to be picking at shiny black. You know, you'll be sacrificing a little bit of flavor, but you're going to be harvesting at the stage when they're firm enough to handle. If you're a pick-your-own farmer, or if you're a home gardener, you have the luxury of waiting till dull black when they taste the absolute best and picking them at that point. They're softer at this point, they're not going to last longer, but they're at their peak of flavor. Triple Crown, no longer under patent, it's thornless. It's a July to August ripening berry. It's definitely under attack from spotted-winged drosophila. We have to recognize that with this type of bramble because they do ripen later in the season. Extremely productive, the most productive in the trials that I've done. The berry size is on the small side, only 5.7 grams, but we've had Triple Crown bushes that have produced 30 pounds of berries per bush, which is just amazing. Good quality if you pick them at the right time, suitable for local sales, but if you're going to do anything beyond local sales, you have to pick them when they're still shiny. Chester, it's a little bit later than Triple Crown, again, very productive. The berries are even smaller than Triple Crown, so recognize that. Suitable for local sales. And Loch Ness, it's no longer under patent. It's a little bit later than the other two that we've mentioned. Moderately productive, even smaller berry size, so recognize that. But to good quality fruit, this is among the firmest of this type of berry. But again, looking at these three types, looking at Triple Crown, Chester, Loch Ness, the one that would be first choice would be Triple Crown. So that's a quick romp through blackberry cultivars. Does anyone have any questions about blackberry cultivars and how to make the choice for their planting?
There's currently no questions in regards to that.
Okay, so we are coming to the end of the workshop. This would be a good time to answer or to ask any questions that you might have. And again, just type them in the chat. We'll hang tight here for a few moments and see if there are any questions that come in.
It's really interesting. I'm sorry, go on.
While we're waiting for any questions related to chat, I'm going to go ahead and send that email out that has the link for the survey that we would like your help in responding to. And again, it's a very short 5-minute survey on Qualtrics. It's an online survey, and it's just done by pressing the appropriate buttons. And I'm also going to be sending to you the 2 presentations in PDF form so that you'll have them for reference. Okay, do we have any questions coming in?
Laura Smith asks, looking at home gardening here in Southwest Missouri, what are your preferred varieties?
For home gardening, any of the cultivars that we talked about would be good ones to consider. But again, in a home garden, I'm all about the best tasting blackberries, right? So looking at cultivars like Osage, like Cato, like Ponca, those would be good ones to plant in the home garden. They also ripen early in the blackberry season before spotted-winged Drosophila becomes a major problem. And they're also ripening early before the weather turns too hot. So they are good ones to consider.
Jean Gillespie asks, would you use Ponca and Cato in containers or Triple Crown?
Triple Crown would be a challenge in a container because it is such a rank, large growing plant. I think the upright types would be better suited. And of those, I've read recently that Ponca actually has shorter primicanes, which makes it more manageable in a container. So Ponca might be a good choice for a container.
Christopher Smith asks, so in terms of wind protection, is my primary concern north winter wind?
From the standpoint of wind protection, the primary concern is actually the wind that comes in May and June. When your primicanes are growing, the connection between the primicane and the crown is a little bit brittle. And if you have wind whipping those primicanes, they can break. Now, again, you can help, if you're at a windy side, you can help by tying the primicanes to a trellis and help stabilize them. But most of the damage I see related to winds is not during the dormant season, but it's during that late spring and early summertime.
Awesome. He said, thank you. Joel Sanders asked, I have just planted Prime Art Freedom. You mentioned the overwintering problems. Can I ameliorate with extra mulch?
You might see some benefit from mulching around the base, but the problem we've seen with Freedom is that the upper parts of the cane are damaged by cold weather. And Freedom has a very stout, stiff cane, and I've tried laying them over to protect them by covering them with a row cover. And while it can be done, there always seems to be some cane breakage. So recognize that. Now, again, growing these as a primicane fruiting crop, you're not concerned about winter damage because you're enjoying that crop on the primicane that grows that current season. So you still will see some harvest off of Freedom, even if we have a cold winter and we lose the overwintering shoots that would have given us a floricane crop. So that's one of the pluses. But again, we have seen some winter injury on Freedom.
Awesome. Lauren Smith said, thank you so much. Very informative presentation.
Oh, my pleasure.
I have a question in regards to the spotted Drosophila.
Yes.
So you said that they came around 2013.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Do you know what the cause of that was? Was it like a heat wave or?
So this is a non-North American native insect. It's actually native to Asia, primarily Korea, Japan, and parts of China. And it was accidentally introduced into this country, and no one knows for sure, but the first reports of it were actually in 2008. And these reports were from the East Coast. And this is an insect that's very small. It's very easy to transport unknowingly. It also blows easily on the wind. And so after those initial outbreaks, it was clear we were unable to contain it. And it very quickly spread across the country. And I think it's been reported from 48 states now. I don't know that there's any spotted-winged Drosophila reported from North Dakota and perhaps Montana, but it's pretty much across the rest of the country. And wherever soft fruits like blackberries, raspberries, blueberries, strawberries, cherries, grapes are grown, spotted-winged Drosophila has become a problem.
Interesting. That's it on the questions.
Okay. Well, very good. I appreciate everyone joining us for the workshop today. Hopefully when things return to normal after COVID-19, we can be together in person and talk more about blackberries. As I mentioned earlier, especially if you're a farmer, please reach out directly. If you have any questions related to blackberries, we can do virtual site visits and virtual consultations. I'd love to visit with you. And I hope that everyone has a chance to satisfy their blackberry interest in 2020. So thank you very much for joining us. And thank you, Hannah, for moderating for us today.
Of course, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
At this point, we will, I think, close down the Zoom session.